Hi, everyone. This is Dean DeFino again. I wanted to sort of bring together some of the skills we've been learning over the course of this semester, skills of summary, of organizing information, bridging what we know and what we don't know, doping out meaning, finding context clues, comparison, all those sorts of things. And finally, sort of articulating why all of these things matter. And in order to do that, I want to do a little bit of a thought experiment. So pretend you're visiting a museum, right? And there would be many reasons why you might do that. Maybe there was an exhibition that you heard about that was exciting to you for one reason or another. Maybe it's pouring rain outside and you've gone inside for shelter. Maybe you've heard they have a great gift shop and you owe your aunt a birthday present, right? All sorts of reasons we might do it. But you're in this museum and you're walking from gallery to gallery, and you come upon a large gallery with a banner over the entryway that says "The Vanity of Small Differences," Grayson Perry. Peculiar, right? What is that exactly? So you go inside. Curiosity draws you inside, and what you see there are white walls covered in 6 enormous woven panels. And as you enter the room, you turn to your right and you see this image. Obviously very rich sort of tapestry here, right? There's all sorts of stuff going on this surface. We have the clutter of an urban environment. We have some sort of a violent accident in the foreground. We have text at the bottom of the page, and we have a bunch of objects from modern life that we would recognize: the golden arches, the cell phone, sunglasses, et cetera, et cetera. But it's difficult to sort of make any sort of sense of what it means. It seems relatively chaotic. So typically what we would do in a museum is turn our attention then to the gallery card, which would give us information about the work in front of us. I'm using an example of a Vincent van Gogh painting here rather than the one that we were just looking at, because I couldn't find an example of a gallery card from this particular show. But it will give you all sorts of information. It will tell you about the artist. It will tell you about the medium. It'll tell you when it was made, why it was made, some sort of descriptive details. So if we're looking at this giant sort of woven image, the gallery card for that, we start with a who. And the who question is answered, it's the artist, right? We've seen his name in the banner as we're walking into the gallery. It's Grayson Perry, a name that you're probably not familiar with, although some of you might be. Relatively famous British artist who's best known for his works of pottery, very ornately decorated pottery that tells all sorts of contemporary stories, but also for his cross-dressing alter ego, Claire, who we see pictured there. So we see the two identities that Grayson Perry identifies by, essentially. And then the what. And the what, we begin by simply looking at the title, right? The title in many cases will be descriptive. Sometimes it'll be something like untitled or a number or something like that that doesn't give us much information. In this particular case, the panel that we're looking at is titled #lamentation, which is immediately going to sort of raise some questions for us. Why is there a hashtag there, right? Lamentation is a term that's associated with late medieval and Renaissance works having to do with the death of Jesus. Probably the most famous example of this is the Pietà from the St. Peter's Basilica, which was carved by Michelangelo, and something that some of you might have seen if you've ever had the opportunity to visit the Vatican. But this hashtag sort of changes the way that we think about that. Then we move on to the how. How is this thing made? And it turns out that what we're looking at here is a tapestry, which is an odd sort of thing, given the fact that people don't really make tapestries anymore. There was a time when tapestry was considered a highly prized art form in the Middle Ages, for example. To be able to afford tapestries on the walls of your stately home, for example, was to suggest that you were a person of wealth and position. So being able to afford it meant that you were, that you were a bigwig, essentially. There were other reasons why tapestries were popular. They're very portable. So if you wanted to move them from one home to another or one room to another, it was a relatively simple thing to do, as opposed to, say, a mural or a fresco that's painted directly on the wall. Tapestries also offered insulation because these old stately homes were pretty drafty and cold. So also sound insulation, by the way, so you weren't getting a lot of echo in the space. So there was a kind of utility value to them, right? It's surprising to see contemporary artists working in tapestry, but it's not absurd to think that someone might. And finally, why? And this is where things get a little tricky, right? Why was this thing made? Not even so much who made it, what it's called, what its materials are, et cetera, but what is its function exactly? And in order to begin to answer that, I think it makes sense to ask the artist. So I'm going to ask your instructors to take a moment and play a brief video, runs about 8 or 10 minutes, where the artist Grayson Perry describes the 6 panels in this thing called The Vanity of Small Differences. So I'll take a moment here, and then we'll come back. Now, Perry gives us a lot of information about the story of Tom Rakewell in this particular case, a tech genius who ends up becoming a multimillionaire and ends up dying in a fiery accident in the middle of a midlife crisis. He crashes his Ferrari while he's sort of drag racing in a place that he shouldn't have, right? There are 2 sources to the story of Tom Rakewell. One of them is an 18th century series of prints and paintings. There were 2 different versions of it, called A Rake's Progress, created by an artist by the name of William Hogarth. Tom Rakewell is the subject in that particular, Tim is the subject. Tim Rakewell in Vanity of Small Differences comes from Tom Rakewell in A Rake's Progress. And you can see just from the titles of the 8 painting series what sort of a story this is. So it's The Heir, which is about this guy receiving at his father's death, his father's very miserly rich man, basically his wealth as a young man. The Levee, which is essentially a royal, a meeting in court with royals, that sort of a thing. So he's advancing in society. The Orgy, which is, obviously a symbol of decadence. The Arrest, which is, Tom Rakewell is sort of reaching this point of decrepitude in his life. The Marriage, an attempt to kind of create respectability for himself. The Gaming House, where he gambles away much of his fortune. The Prison, where he lands in as a result of debt and other misdeeds. And finally, The Madhouse, which is the image that we see here, right? So clearly a story that goes down, right? The Rake's Progress is not an advancement, it's a decline. The second source for Vanity of Small Differences is Christian painting of the 15th century, specifically painting having to do with certain moments in the life of Jesus, right? So subjects would include the Adoration, which is essentially the birth, right? The ministry, Jesus teaching, the agony, which is the agony in the garden, or expulsion, the Annunciation of, spirit into heaven, that sort of a thing. And Lamentation, which is the subject of this particular panel that we'll be looking at again in a second. The Lamentation is the weeping over the death of Jesus, right? This is the unresurrected Jesus. And we see one such 15th century image here. This is a Dutch painting where we see that subject portrayed, right? Where Jesus is being held in the arms of his mother, Mary. John the Evangelist is kneeling nearby. The patron who paid for this painting is standing beside them bearing witness, because if you pay for it, you obviously you get to be in the picture, that sort of a thing, essentially. So these sorts of images are the source of the 6 tapestries that we see in Vanity of Small Differences. Let's go back to the name for a second, which tells us a lot about what it's supposed to mean. Lamentation, right? This weeping, this grieving the death or grieving loss, etc. But in this particular case, it's a hashtag lamentation, which is to say it's part of a social media stream, essentially, right? It's a bit of data as opposed to a tragic subject per se, right? That it's being reduced in terms of its currency, its social value by putting that hashtag in front of it. It's still an awful, gory, tragic scene, but as compared to, say, Giotto's version of the Lamentation of Jesus, where you see the angels in the heaven and you see several of his apostles standing around, as well as many of his followers mourning his death. The subject is much more sort of pious and respectful there than what we see in Grayson Perry's version of the narrative. The next clue here is language. At the bottom of this last frame, and again, this is the 6th of 6 frames here, right? This is the end of the line, as we saw in Perry's description of it. There's text, which tells us something about what's going on in the scene. And in order to punch this up, I have basically drawn it, you know, I've given you a readable version of it, I suppose. And this is what it says at the bottom of this panel. We were walking home from a night out. These two cars racing each other speed past. Middle-aged men showing off. The red one, that's to say the Ferrari here that we see against the signpost. The red one lost control. The driver wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He didn't stand a chance. The female passenger was okay, but catatonic with shock. I'm a nurse. I tried to save the man, but he died in my arms. It was only afterwards I found out he was that famous computer guy, Rakewell. All he said to me was, "Mother, all that money," and he dies in the gutter. Now, there are several things that are punched up here. First of all, it's identifying for us who the key players are. This is Tim Rakewell, who's, you know, died in the arms of this nurse who happens to be walking by. The woman standing in the background with gore all over her dress, it turns out, is Tim Rakewell's young new wife. We see the EMTs, although you can't see them in this particular picture. And we hear Tim's last word, which is mother. And then this kind of despairing last line, all that money and he dies in the gutter, right? Isn't this sort of tragic? Isn't this more than tragic? Isn't this pathetic? If you compare this to, excuse me, that image in the Hogarth print, The Madhouse, and again, you know, we're jumping back in time a couple hundred years here, so the language is going to look significantly different. But listen even to the tone of the language. Madness, thou chaos of the brain, what art that pleasure givest in pain? Tyranny of fancy's reign, mechanic fancy that can build vast labyrinths and mazes wild with rule disjointed, shapeless measure, filled with horror, filled with pleasure, etc. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. There's a strong sense of almost operatic emotion in the language here. There's a lot of exclamation points. There's a lot of highly elevated language, which is to express this idea of a scene of heightened or exaggerated or even strained human emotion, as compared to the sort of pathetic or bathetic even quality of the Perry image. And then we start to look a little deeper into details in this frame. And again, comparing to this image of lamentation. So we have the two side by side. There's the 15th century lamentation and there's the 21st century hashtag lamentation. One of the first things that one notices immediately, beyond the fact that the bodies are falling in a similar posture in order to reference each other, so we can immediately see that context if we have any awareness of art history at all, is the difference in the place here, right? That Jesus dies at Golgotha, the place of the skull, which is a place associated with death, but is also a kind of sacred place, right? It's sacred in the sense that Christians believe God was, crucified there. So there's sanctification in the blood of Jesus, as opposed to the blood of Tim Rakewell, which is splashed over this scene of urban sprawl in an unnamed city. Although if you investigate a little deeper into this work, you know that it's Sunderland, which is in the kind of Midlands of England, kind of nondescript city of no particular historical importance that happens to be where Tim Rakewell lives, right? He's surrounded by kind of the clutter of contemporary life rather than the sense of order and decorum and grace and sanctity, frankly. If we look even closer at those two scenes, we'll notice a transposition here. The two images are transposed with each other. In the 15th century version of the Lamentation, Lying next to Jesus is the skull. Remember what I said, the Golgotha is called the place of the skull because it's a place where people went to be crucified, and there were thousands of people crucified there over the years. But the skull here is a particularly important symbol because it's a symbol of our mortality, right? It's a symbol of death. It's a symbol of decay. And in that sense, contrasts itself to the symbolism of Jesus, who promises eternal life and salvation, and so on and so forth. So these two things are held in contrast to each other as a way of our understanding what the value of a belief in Christian salvation is to a believer, right? It's the avoidance of death to a large extent, or at least it's the avoidance of the permanence of death, maybe a better way of looking at it. In the Tim Rakewell story, #lamentation, the skull is replaced by a cracked cell phone, right? This very common object, which is also associated with the subject of this particular series, since Tim Rakewell is a tech multimillionaire. So obviously the phone is not only part of his business, it's also, in an indirect way, part of what his ilk produces, right? So he's creating this kind of talismanic object. You may recall the worshiping of the cell phone in the first of the panels that Grayson Perry was describing. It becomes kind of almost like the communion, right? In the benediction of the communion, the sacred object that we worship, right? And in this case, it's kind of broken and battered thing. It's not about transcendence at all. It's about the kind of destructibility and the disposability of objects in contemporary life. So I wanted to sort of highlight one last detail here that I think is really kind of significant, or at least it is for me in any case. It's this magazine that is kind of thrown out of Tim Rakewell's car as a result of the accident. It's called Hello. Hello is sort of the British equivalent of People magazine, right? It's not a particularly it's certainly not literary. It's a kind of pop magazine, right? And the cover story here is of Tim and his new bride, the woman that we saw in the background that's covered in his blood. Tim and Amber, exclusive photos of software genius and his new wife, right? Now, there are a couple of things that are interesting about this. First of all, the fact that Tim has it in his car, right, suggests that he values whatever it is, that whatever cultural capital being on the cover of the equivalent of People magazine offers him, right? Which suggests that he isn't necessarily someone that's looking for, I don't know, there's a big difference between being People magazine and having a statue built to you in the center of the town square, right? It's a very disposable thing. It's a very cheap thing. It's a thing of no value, right? Which gets us to kind of the thesis of the vanity of small differences, right? Which is that as described in that video of Grayson Perry, what sort of brought about this project was a study of values, class, and taste in contemporary Britain. And one of the things that Perry noticed while he was gathering information about this, while he was touring around the country, is that the differences between what, say, the middle class want and what the rich want are very small, or even what they have access to, right? That it isn't a qualitatively different thing that they want. They want a faster car, they want a better phone, they want a bigger house, as opposed to wanting something that is fundamentally different, right? The vanity here, of course, is suggested in this image right here, which is the vanity of Tim Rakewell and kind of carrying this talisman of his own image around with him. So we see all sorts of opportunities to kind of read into the why here, right? Why is Grayson Perry making this thing, right? Not what are we looking at, which we've discussed a little bit, and not how do we understand the meaning of it, which we discussed in terms of context and comparison and all those sorts of things, but the why, right? Why is he making these giant garish tapestries with all of this sort of clutter of contemporary life on it? Why is he calling it the vanity of small differences? What is the purpose? What's the thesis here, I suppose? And now that we have enough information and we know a little bit about the historical context for this, as well as something of the artist himself, although you're certainly welcome to look much more deeply into all of these things, we can begin to draw some conclusions. And I'd be eager to hear what some of the conclusions are that you have drawn.